Welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Each of us, whether we know it or not, we have an origin story. Something happened in our childhood, in our formative years, that shaped who we would become. This is the story of every one of us, including my guest, Danny Torres. He is the pastor of Swerve Church in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Danny, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Hey, thank you. Great. Happy to be here.
So, Danny, I've known you since I lived in New York, and you have been serving at Swerve for years. And it's been incredible to see the work that you all are doing. But my first question, as I dive into this, I want to know what inspired that? Like, why Bushwick? Why Brooklyn?
Well, Bushwick is the neighborhood I was born and raised in. And by God's grace, been 8 years now going at this church planting thing, trying to help love and serve our neighbors, show God's love in tangible ways, and just trying our best to introduce our neighbors to Jesus and the hope of the gospel. So Bushwick is home, and it's the place that has my heart. It's a place that formed me, that made me, and that is a huge part of raising our family here in the neighborhood as well. And so while the church is about 8 years old, Raleigh, the Lord broke my heart a little over 13 years ago to try to plant a life-giving, gospel-centered work here to help love and serve our neighbors and to introduce people to Jesus. So it's been a long road, a long, hard journey.
You know, it's interesting because so many of us, when we go into ministry or our vocations, they lead us away from home, and it's as if yours led you back, and not only led you back, but led your family back, your wife, your children, and you're dedicated to the city, you're dedicated to the neighborhood. What's that like when you're centering yourself there, when with gentrification, so many people are either being priced out or are moving out while others move in?
Yeah, Raleigh, well, as someone who lived in New York City, you know how transient the city can be, and especially neighborhoods like Bushwick. Bushwick is a small neighborhood in the tippy top of Brooklyn, less than 2 square miles, home to about 140,000 people. It was the 7th most impoverished neighborhood in all of New York City. But in 2015, Vogue magazine published an article listing out the coolest neighborhoods, not in New York City, but in the whole world. And Bushwick, Brooklyn ranked number 7. So how can you be the 7th poorest neighborhood in New York City and the 7th coolest neighborhood in the world, at least according to Vogue magazine, is this thing called gentrification that you just alluded to. It's this dynamic of being surrounded by great impoverishment, our neighbors living on New York City government assistance and food stamps and Section 8 and all the works. And then also this dynamic of new people coming into the neighborhood that are a little more well off, able to afford some of the newer apartments and developments that are coming into the community. And it creates this clashing of cultures here in our neighborhood.
And so you have been a lifelong fan of Bushwick. You love Bushwick. And with gentrification being what it is and being the reality that it is, were you affected as a child? Was your family affected as it was starting to change before it made it into Vogue magazine?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's funny, Raleigh, is that gentrification for the people that live here, boots on the ground, it feels like it happens overnight, right? It feels like this family just moved into our block, or this building just got renovated, overnight. And it feels like it's happening immediately. But of course, gentrification happens over years and over decades even. Developers that have the foresight to be able to see, hey, this neighborhood, can make us some money, maybe because of its proximity to New York City or whatever, to the Manhattan rather, or whatever the case is. And so I certainly began to see it in my through high school age. I was living on Bushwick Avenue and Montrose Avenue. Growing up, that part of the neighborhood was always considered Bushwick. I lived on Bushwick Avenue. But as gentrification began to press in to our neighborhood, some of these city lines get drawn out on Google Maps, and now it's marketed at East Williamsburg. And I began to notice how the block we lived on used to never have any kind of police presence. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of cops that are patrolling the streets. There's new coffee shops that are opening up vegan restaurants. There's a vegan donut shop still there till this day. There was just little culture shifts that were happening in our neighborhood right underneath our noses. And I was able to see this firsthand because my dad, he opened up a dry cleaners on the corner of Montrose and Bushwick Avenue. He came up here from Puerto Rico as a young man and just aspiring to make it in New York City and live the dream. Met his wife here, my mom, and got married, had 3 kids, and then was offered the opportunity of a lifetime to purchase a business and be the owner of a dry cleaners. And for about 20 plus years of his life, he was on there on the corner serving the neighbors there with their dry cleaning. And while we were there, some developers started one by one buying people out from the apartment building that the dry cleaners was in, the commercial space was in. And one by one, they just started buying people out until they got to my dad and told him, hey, we want you to get out of your business. We want to give you some money so that you can head out. My dad said no. And this was his livelihood. This was everything. This is how he provided for his family. And at this point in time, it was all he knew and what he did really, really well at. This went on for some time when these developers would come in. And this is a tactic that they use here in Raleigh. They strong arm. They try to threaten. These developers try to threaten people out of the facilities that they're in. And usually they prey on people that are less than knowledgeable about what they have and what they own, or that are under-resourced and can't really fight their way through it, right? Because to get lawyers and go to court requires a lot of time and a lot of money to be able to do that. Eventually, these developing bullies came and told my dad, hey, either you take what we're going to give you or we'll take you to court and we'll get you out for free. And that was the threat that pushed my dad over the line. And he was forced to take what they were offering for the business and kind of uproot his whole reality up until that time. It was gentrification at its finest here in the neighborhood, which a lot of people don't realize. There's a layer of injustice. Raleigh, there's 2 sides to the gentrification coin. And there's the side where you see cleaner streets, safer streets, nicer parks. You see amenities and nice buildings, which, as someone who lives here, you can't afford to live there, but hey, it's nice to look at, to see that it's there. But then the other side of that coin is people that have made up the fabric of this community that's been here for generations can no longer afford to stay here, and they're forced out. And they're forced out in some very unjust ways.
And so you're facing this injustice. You're seeing it firsthand. You're seeing how your dad is trying to do the right thing for the community. And I loved how you said that. He was there to care for the neighbors and do their dry cleaning. He was living out his vocation. He was taking care of his family, and he's adding value to the neighborhood. But you're right. Like a lot of people, they see the cleaner streets. They see the increased police presence. They see the safety increase, and they love that. They love the vegan breakfast spots. They love the coffee shops. One thing I noticed when I lived in New York is every now and then you'd walk into a neighborhood and maybe there's this abandoned building that had been there for 20 years and they had some plywood covering the windows, and someone's living in it. Someone snuck in there somehow. But then all of a sudden, a local coffee shop opens up in the bottom. And for me, that was always the sign of, oh, this neighborhood's changing, because they have the cool, chic coffee shop where everyone from other neighborhoods are coming into it now to get coffee there. And then all of a sudden, those turn into condos. And now you have condos above the coffee shop. And then you have these other shops opening up in the buildings. And then the adjacent buildings start changing. And we can really like seeing neighborhoods shift, but we don't oftentimes recognize, like what you said, the injustice that can happen, the strong arming that can happen, the people being priced out, and basically rent being raised or things like that, to where people can't stay and almost forcing them out of the community. When this happened, did you see kind of a mass exodus of family and friends leave the community of Bushwick, Brooklyn?
Yeah, there certainly has been an exodus out of the city. And of course, this has been exacerbated by the pandemic, of course. It's just the same where a lot of people are, seeking out opportunities to head out as the community changes. And it's something that continues to happen till this day. But it's fascinating because I view this social issue of gentrification in my neighborhood. I view it through a gospel lens, and this is what maybe is a little bit different between the way I view this and the way some of my neighbors view it. The boots on the ground, people are upset. They're upset that their neighborhood is changing. They're angered by the new people that are coming in. They are frustrated when another U-Haul truck, double parks while people load and unload to move into the apartments. However, I view this not only as a resident, not only as a lifelong New Yorker, but I view this through a gospel lens. And the gospel compels me to love my neighbor as myself, and whether they look like me or whether they don't. And this is what's kind of unique about me and what's kind of unique about, I think, where the Lord has us here in planting Swerve Church and trying to provide a space, trying to provide a church family and a church community that is able to bridge some of these cultural gaps under the umbrella of the gospel, to try to formulate a family that's not one way or the other, but to honestly allow the gospel to do the work that it can only do and provide a new family that's shaped by the gospel. You know, if you go around my neighborhood and you go to some of those coffee shops and you go to some of these art galleries and bars and even in the park, these public spaces do not do a good job at bringing both sides of our community together. They're very siloed. The coffee shop tends to attract one type of clientele. And even in that, you have two types of coffee shops. You have the mom and pops, been here for a while from the neighborhood. And then you have the newer hipster kind of looking coffee shop that only attracts one type of customer. I believe that there's only one institution that is able to bridge some of these cultural gaps and bring these people to bring both sides together. That is the local church. The way I say it is the only thing that can bridge the gap between hip hop and hipster is the gospel. I believe
Yeah.
that with all my heart. That's what it's going to take. It's going to take a humbling on both sides of the fence here to formulate a new family under the gospel. In fact, maybe even seeing this through a missional lens as an opportunity to engage some of the folks that are coming into our neighborhood with the hope of the gospel and providing them a family and a community for them to plug into and be a part of.
Well, and you're taking Bushwick for what it is. You're not running from the reality. You're not living in the past. You're saying, okay, regardless of how this has impacted me, regardless of how I would want this to be, I'm accepting what the situation is. And I'm coming as scripture calls me to a minister of reconciliation. I love how in the Bible you see the Apostle Paul and different teachers saying that at the end of the day, it's for the Jew and the Gentile. There's no slave nor free, no male nor female, no Jew nor Gentile. We're all one in Christ. And you're able to take that message of reconciliation to two primary groups in your neighborhood, right? Two groups that would be pitted against each other, two groups that might be talking about the other at their respective coffee shops or diners. And I've one of the last times I was in Bushwick, it was in the early days of this podcast, and I recorded a couple of episodes in this kind of state of the art studio. It was cool. Like I had a friend I was interviewing there who lived in Bushwick, and we're doing that. But to get there, you're walking through the Bushwick that's not developed yet. And it's funny because there are two worlds. There's the world that has been gentrified and developed and all that. And then there's the world that was just kind of left. It was under resourced. It's like people didn't care. Like the people that were there that were actually trying to do good work oftentimes didn't have the resources to continue in an ever evolving New York City. And I love what you're doing is you're not saying this group is evil or this group is evil. You're saying at the end of the day, We are all broken and impacted by brokenness. Whether you just moved in or you've been here 100 years, and God wants a family to be here. And I think we can have people from both Bushwicks in the church. What has that been like to lead a group that consists of people who have benefited from gentrification and people who've been hurt by it?
Well, that is certainly a challenge because it's easier said than done, right? There's cultural differences that stand in the way in trying to engage us. And the most that we can do, of course, is try to create that family and invite people to be a part of it. We can't force anyone to be a part of it, right? You know what's interesting, Raleigh, is that I believe this with all my heart. New York City needs every type of church. We
Mm,
need the ethnic church, right? But even within Hispanic culture, and I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Latino, I understand that there's a difference between South Central American and also like Caribbean Latino. And a lot
yeah,
of those churches that are Hispanic, you notice that they kind of stick to one side or the other. There's not a meshing of that too much. And I think that's okay because I think, people connect, right, with their people group, with their heart language and with some of their cultural differences. I can take you to an African American church, right? And they do church the way they do and hoot and holler and they got, the suit and tie and all that stuff. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful expression of the church. I can take you to a hipster church where, the pastor has a cool haircut, ripped jeans and tattoos, and everybody looks one type of way. And maybe they're all new transplants that have come to the city. And New York City is so lost that I believe we need all of that.
yeah.
But I also think that there is a place and there's a way that we can do church and ministry where we can reflect heaven a little bit and we can count the costs, and it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be hard. And it's probably not going to be a mega church. However, it's going to be an expression of heaven. It's going to be an expression of the gospel. It's going to invite both
Mm,
sides of the table to sit and eat and endure and struggle with being uncomfortable. Okay.
yeah.
Because, maybe one of them vegan people are going to come in and, Puerto Ricans love to have pork shoulder and chicken and with everything. And so we're going to have to sacrifice, right? And learn how to cross those cultures and serve one another, right? The Bible talks about bearing one another's burdens, right? Being able to serve one another. One another is a scripture. There's opportunities for us to be able to exercise that and embrace the awkwardness of sitting at the table with somebody who doesn't look like us, who doesn't have the same upbringing or level of education or socioeconomic status, but we have one thing in common, that we've surrendered to the lordship of Jesus Christ, and we can sit at the table together and embrace that and build a new family under the umbrella of the gospel.
Well, and I think all of us, we value comfort oftentimes at the expense of growth and at the expense of gospel dependence. When I work with a church, I'm always trying to encourage them to identify their most vulnerable neighbor and then to include that vulnerable neighbor in their church where they're sitting in the pew together, where they have the same exact value, where they have the same exact purpose to worship God and to serve and love the community. And that can be messy, especially when your neighbor's issues are not your issues. And so now that can frustrate you, regardless of which side of the fence you're on. It can frustrate you because you don't understand. Their burdens are not your burdens yet. But what the gospel does, it invites us to depend solely on Jesus and say, okay, this is frustrating, but I'm trusting you, and when we're trusting in the gospel and we're getting to know that neighbor who's different than us, this amazing thing happens and it's God ordained, but their issues as we grow to be friends with them slowly but surely start to become our issues. We start to listen to them rather than pretend that we know what they're experiencing. We start to take what they're experiencing to heart. And then we may not be dealing with what they're dealing with, but we begin to advocate for them. And we can only do that if we're doing life together. And it's messy and it's hard, but I think that's where this gospel beauty comes from. It's when you have people who are basically odd fellows and they would never hang out in the same places. They're sitting in the same row at the same church, and they're almost, well, they're just invited to get to know about the other's experience, because things are tough all over, but that toughness differs.
Yeah, as a church, we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and
Mm.
we've been in Mark chapter 6 for some time. And in Mark chapter 6, Jesus shifts from doing all the ministry himself to sending the disciples out to go and do ministry. And one of the things he tells them, he's like, "Hey guys, grab your staff, but leave everything else behind, right? Leave your wallet, leave the extra shirt and all this stuff. Just go out and live with the people. If somebody welcomes you, stay at their house as long as you're welcome." And I think what he was teaching his disciples and what we can kind of learn as a takeaway from that is what you're talking about there is an incarnational type of ministry. When our neighbors' problems become our problems, right? What our neighbors eating, we're with them. We're able to kind of see and understand, man, the social problems of the people that are here, they're my social problems too, because I'm a part of the fabric of this community. I'm doing life on life with the people that God has called me to serve.
And I love this incarnational piece because it requires a vulnerability. It requires a willingness to stay rooted in your community. It's very easy to grow a faith community and kind of be a city unto itself. But we do need to be in the community for the benefit of the community, but also for our benefit. The community speaks to the church and the church speaks to the community. And they should both be there. We shouldn't just hide from the community. We shouldn't hide from culture. We shouldn't hide from roast pork shoulder, but we should be there. Like I remember I had a group, they were working with Let My People Go. We were doing one of our experience trips in New York, and we reached out to you and we were able to partner with you and your church to deliver food for Christmas. This was last Christmas. And what was cool was like the whole community turns out. There's all sorts of people. And it was wild. I just remember they served everybody Chipotle and that thing. I mean, we were like jackals, we just tore into that. But we were doing good work. We were hungry. Like we had been packing bags and putting all sorts of things that had been donated to give back to the community. And I loved that because that's not necessarily sensational work. That's not the work that you do to be like, "Hey, everybody, look at what I'm doing." It's more of like, it was a little tough. There was a lot of work to be done. It was kind of monotonous, but what I kept telling the group was, guys, we do this because it's in the monotony that we're serving our neighbor. This isn't the thing that you're going to put on Facebook and say, "Hey, everybody, look at me." This is, we're able to provide for a need to help people who may be under resourced. And what I just loved was people from the neighborhood were giving back, even if they were facing the same issues. And I think that's what being a neighbor looks like. What were your thoughts on that day? I mean, I've shared mine, but how did you process what we did that day?
Yeah, absolutely. And this might even make for a whole new podcast, perhaps, because a big value of ours as a church is that we're going to serve our community. We're going to be Christ's hands and feet, love and serve our neighbors, show God's love in tangible ways. And for us, this is not a bait and switch. Our serving is informed by our theology. What you
Good.
just said a moment ago. We love our neighbor because we were first loved, right? By Christ. Because Jesus commands us to love and serve our neighbors. And so we're going to look for those opportunities. We're not going to grow our church because somebody received a Christmas gift or because we packed them a bag. It's not a bait and switch for us.
That's
We
right.
simply love and serve our neighbors because the gospel compels us to do so. And so I think that was a wonderful opportunity to be able to do that and to rub elbows. I remember that day I was packing some food next to this lady that I probably would never have met in any other circumstance. She was a good bit older than me, but we were able to have a good conversation, as we were packing these meals for people that were going to come and pick up. It was a wonderful opportunity. I agree with you. It was hard work and it was tedious. And it was a lot. There was more work that needed to get done. And we didn't even stay until the end. They had more volunteers that were coming in, but it was a wonderful way to demonstrate the impact of the gospel on our lives and to be able to rub elbows with people who don't know Jesus just yet.
And yeah, to your point, one thing I loved was oftentimes as a church, when we serve the community, and we do this, I think, for good reasons, we'll put in our information, let them know where the stuff came from, let them know what the church is doing. And I think that can be okay. I don't think that's always like a surreptitious thing. However, you don't have to do that. Sometimes you can just serve as the church and expect nothing back. You go in full relational. You just meet people, you talk to people. And I think sometimes that is better than putting in like, hey, here are hours or here's a little bag. Because I noticed you did not do that. There was no Swerve Church information that went out. This was, we just see ourselves as neighbors. We want to serve our community. Here's an opportunity. We're going to mobilize to help our community. And I thought that was incredible because on one hand, maybe you don't benefit. But on the other hand, I don't think there's any way you don't benefit because people see that you're coming and you're being authentic and you're being real and you're earning goodwill. I mean, people are just seeing that, yes, this pastor actually cares about this evolving community. And he cares for the people that were here first. He cares for the people who are here now. Because regardless of who's there, they're in his path. And that's what the Good Samaritan says is our neighbor, the person in our path, that person experiencing vulnerability. And so, yeah, I agree with you so strongly because I think that is such a good way to do it. And I think sometimes we do it the other way where we have to let people know what we're doing because we've always done it that way. We don't know that we're actually just free to say, nah, I'm showing up not because I'm trying to grow my church. Maybe that happens. Cool. I'm going because I'm commanded to be a neighbor, first and foremost. God is calling me by his love for me. He loved me first, and now he's freeing me to love others. And so, yes, I thought that was incredible. And the amount of people that showed up, and then just the different people. I loved being able to show the students. I was like, okay, so see that? Now, that's someone who is a state congressperson, and they're here to be present to show their constituents that they care. And like, kind of walking them through even the political aspect of serving the community. And there's so many things that you probably deal with. You're probably dealing with the political sphere, the legal sphere, all these different spheres as you're caring for your neighbor. What has that been like as you touch on these kind of holistic themes in caring for your community?
Well, I always tell folks there's like one question that keeps me up at night, and there's no new quote. And you've heard this, I'm sure, many times before. But the question is, if the doors of your church close tomorrow, would anybody from the community miss it? And I want Swerve to be a place that if the doors of our church close tomorrow, that our neighbors would ride and picket because they knew that Swerve was good news to the community. And one of the ways we can be good news is by being good neighbors and partnering with other community organizations that are doing great work to come alongside of them and so that they can see that Swerve is a contributing member of the community, of the neighborhood, and that we genuinely love our neighbors. A lot of churches, they'll do like a one-off serve day, right? And it's a big push and they got t-shirts and they'll have a bunch of people, these larger churches, and it's one day out of the year that they're serving their neighbors, doing phenomenal stuff, right? But it's
That's
one
right.
day. For Swerve, this is just part of our rhythm. This is part of of what we do, And maybe it's a blessing and a curse to be in New York City where there's so much lostness and people that are so far from God that they are not going to come to church because they received a turkey from you. We'll set up a George Foreman grill and cook hot dogs for the neighbors here. People are not going to come to church because they got a free hot dog, from the church. However, it's an opportunity, right? To be able to show and demonstrate the love of Jesus, to begin a dialogue, to get to know our neighbors' names, to build a relationship. And then what ends up happening, Raleigh, is a lot of times they say, why are you giving me a free hot dog? What's this about? Oh,
yeah.
Well, let me just tell you that there's a church here that cares about its neighbors and we care about you. And just letting you know that we're here for you, that we care about you tremendously.
I remember having a conversation with my friend Frank Williams at Wake Eden Baptist Church years ago. And Wake Eden Baptist Church is in the Bronx. And we were working with them and just trying to to dream and think through, like, what does it look like to really impact the neighborhood, love the community? And that is a core value for Frank in their church. And so we're sitting here having this conversation, and he said this. He said, I don't want us to be a mausoleum. I want us to be a mission center. And so many churches, people in the community know them. You're on the hill. They see the building. They know what you're about, but they don't know you. It's like walking through a cemetery and you're like, that is a beautiful mausoleum, but no one's coming out of it. It's like, for all intents and purposes, for the city, it's dead. And so when you ask that question, if we were to close our doors tomorrow, would the community be different? Well, the only way for the community to be different, whether your church is large or small, is if you, as a vulnerable person, stand in front of another vulnerable person and trust that the God who is vulnerability personified will show up and be present in that conversation and break chains and break barriers and break the things that keep you from one another and ultimately bring you together in Jesus. That's the only thing we've got. That's all we got, and I think the communities, they're tired. They're tired of the mausoleums. And whether they can bring it up or not, they want to see churches serving. They may not want to see the church serving them because they might not be there yet, but they want to see the churches actually being relevant to the community. Would you agree?
Yeah. So, one of the reasons I think as a church planner, right? One of the struggles that we find in the city is trying to find space to meet. There's a lot of empty venues and spaces throughout the city. But the moment you reach out to a landlord and you tell them you want to put a church in their space, they automatically say no. And I think the reason that is, even if you have all the money and resources in the world, I think the reason that is because the church has little perceived value.
Yeah.
Because if we're not present and if we're not serving and if we're not visible to our neighbors, to the neighbors, there's little value that we bring to the community as contributing members. And so they would much rather put a coffee shop or a restaurant or another bodega or another barbershop in those spaces because the perceived value of those places increases, right? The value of the space. But if churches were present, if we were doing that incarnational ministry that we mentioned before, then the neighbors would see that this church it's important that this church is here and that they're doing something to care for the people on this block. When we first moved into this space that I'm recording this at today, the first day we came in here and started renovating, we got the windows all tagged up with graffiti. We cleaned it up. They did it again. They did it a couple more times. They would tag up all the front part of our little space here, and we would just clean it up and keep serving our neighbors and give out free backpacks and do a little hot dogs and block parties, right? And do a Christmas tree lighting and invite our neighbors to be a part of it. Eventually, you know what happened? The guys on the block that were doing that saw that we were here for them and that we were here for their moms and their aunts and their nieces and nephews. And they saw that we were bringing value to the block. And now we don't get tagged up. They leave us alone. They'll tag the door next door and they'll leave the church alone because they understand that we're here for them.
Yeah, I lived in a neighborhood like that once where there was someone who was a drug dealer across the street. And I think my downstairs neighbor had a conversation with him. And he's like, hey, man, we got kids here, and there was this, they knew that we weren't causing any trouble in the community and that we were there for the community. And we may have a different background or, like we were seminary students. And the community looked out for us. Even though there was a lot of uncertainty in the community looked out for us because they knew that we were there to respect people. We weren't, I'll never forget, I parked my car on the wrong side of the road and a guy came out, yelled at me, and I said, my bad, I'll move it, move the car. And after that, like, we were loved. It was just like, because we didn't come in there into the neighborhood acting like we owned it. We came in there saying, we're just here. We're neighbors, man. Like, it's not. And I think there's something with the posture, as you describe how your church You came out and you cleaned off the graffiti, and then they did it again and you cleaned it off and you did it again. And then over time, they realized that you weren't a threat. And so now all the other neighbors that aren't doing the same work, regardless of what they're doing, they're going to get tagged. But you, they see you as one of them now. And that had got that has got to be one of the best feelings. Like, how did you feel when you finally realized, oh, wait a minute, did we just get accepted into the neighborhood?
Yeah, it's certainly a great feeling, and we're praying hard for some people on this block here that are set up on the corner doing their business there, and we're praying hard for them. We pray that the Lord would encounter them right where they are and that would save them and use them for his kingdom's sake and his glorious purposes. It's a great feeling to know that they know that we're here for them. At the same time, man, we are praying hard that the Holy Spirit captures their heart and that they see that we're more than bringers of hot dogs and of community get-togethers, but that we have the hope of the gospel that we want to get to them, and that the Lord might transform their lives that way.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's not about the hot dog, even though hot dogs are delicious. It's about the relationship. It's about showing them in a tangible way that they matter, that you care. And I think that's the beauty that backs up our words, because people in New York, people really in any community in the world, we're all used to people saying things. But when that person sits down and says, no, like, I'm here, I'm rooted, we're here for you. What do you need? What are you seeing? What are the things that scare you in the community? What are the things that encourage you about the community? When you're able to have those gut level conversations and then grow in that, I mean, I think that's when we start to see the seeds of reconciliation being placed. Like, like Danny, how would how would you encourage our listeners who want to be part of this reconciliation movement? They want their church to move from being the mausoleum to the mission center.
Well, I think it requires an immense amount of presence. I remember early on when starting to receive this call to plant the church. I'm just feeling burdened by the Lord for my community. I remember walking down Knickerbocker Avenue,
Mm,
and there was a guy passed out. He could have been drunk or dead, not sure. There was a couple across the street. The guy had his fist in his air, just yelling at her. She has tears. And I'm just walking down Knickerbocker Avenue, and it's just another day in Bushwick. I've been around this my whole life, and I was numb to what I was seeing around me. And all of a sudden, it hit me like a sack of bricks. This is not normal.
yeah.
Uh, this is brokenness. And I began to pray, Lord, give me the eyes of a missionary. Allow me to see my community through your lens, not just as somebody who's been here my whole life, but to see the pockets of brokenness and how you want to bring, like you mentioned earlier, Raleigh, that reconciliation work. How do you want to save and redeem and draw people onto yourself? Because this is not normal. And I think that requires an immense amount of presence. You have to have your eyes open. You have to be present where you are. You can't just live 45 minutes away from the neighborhood you're pastoring in. Okay. Come in on a Sunday for 2 hours and then go back home, because your neighbor's problems are not your problems. You're not, you're not sewn into the fabric of the community.
That's right.
You have to live incarnationally. You have to walk with your eyes open and be present, be there so that you can understand, man, what are the problems that my neighbors are facing? And you won't be able to feel it any more deeply than when it becomes your problem just the same. And for that to happen, you have to be there. You have to be present. You have to walk with your eyes open.
That's such good advice. You have to walk with your eyes open, because I had a situation like that in my life too, where I felt called to address human trafficking, but I would almost have to step over people experiencing homelessness to get to my meetings. And I started to feel like a hypocrite. I'm like, I'm over here celebrating what I'm doing. While here's my neighbor. Here's my neighbor, and I'm almost purposefully ignoring my neighbor, and I've become numb to it. And then I just asked, I said, God, what do you want us to do? And then I started reading the scriptures, and over and over and over, you see the big three, right, in the Old Testament: the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, the people that do not have representation. They have no one looking out for them. They need a family. And then you see in Psalm 68 that God puts the solitary in families. And oftentimes, our churches can be families for vulnerable populations. We may not be the same. But then you have the New Testament. You have the least of these. What you did for the least of these, you did for me. And what I've noticed is in both cases, we see God identifying with vulnerable people and inviting his people to join him. And I think that is what you have challenged us with today. That God loves us. He loves those around us. He loves our communities. And he is inviting us to start a conversation. Danny, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been good.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.